Welcome back to another episode on Genealogy TV. Today we are talking specifically about World War II military records in the United States. Ashley has a bit of knowledge about this. She's done a fair amount of research using some of our record resources and
Mhm,
what's available, what's not available, and that kind of stuff. But as we're always thinking about military records, we're working backwards, right? And so that's just another one of those pieces of the military, record sets that we're looking for. And so let's start with just briefly talking about draft registration cards. Let's start
mhm.
there. Depending on the time period, people had to fill out draft registration cards. It could have even been World War One, could have been after World War II. We're kind of focused on World War II today, but just because they filled out a draft registration card does not necessarily mean that they served. So, Ashley, you're starting to become an expert in some of this area. Help us understand World War II records, military records. Obviously, there's going to be for those who served, those who didn't serve. Help me out.
So, like you said, the draft card is simply, registering for that draft. It is compulsory, at least it was here in the United States, and it's kind of divided up into groups based on age and that sort of thing. So, the draft card, like you said, doesn't always mean that they did serve in that capacity. For instance, I saw that my great grandfather, whom I'll discuss his information. I actually looked very hard at his draft card, and they actually wrote in the upper corner, "Enlisted."
Okay.
Just keep an eye out for that. Yeah, that was something that as you're sort of, picking that information and what you're looking for, paying attention to those small details because you might miss it.
Now, I do know the original draft cards were for men that were born, I think, between 1877 and 1927. But then there was also the old man's draft, which
Yes.
I believe was created in 1942 for men born between 1877 and 1897. So, be thinking of that because, and here's a great AI story. I hadn't even thought about this with one of my ancestors. I was doing some research and I had sent a bunch of these records into Notebook LM, I think it was. And I
Mhm.
said, hey, let's correlate this evidence. And what am I missing? And it said, go look for the old man's draft because your guy was within the time frame. And I hadn't even thought about it in that particular situation. I didn't find him in the old man's draft, but he should have been there. But sometimes we get lucky and sometimes we don't. So, what are you going to find in a draft registration card?
Is gonna give you a lot of information about their current whereabouts, their names, sometimes their occupation and their employer. If they have a next of kin, whether that's their wife and or a child or parent, and usually that relationship is indicated.
Yeah, a lot of times I like that line that says something about who is gonna know exactly where you are at all times or something like that, and a
Mhm.
lot of times it's a father or mother, and it's listed there, sometimes it's a spouse. Occasionally, I've seen on draft registration cards too, where it'll say wife and 1 child,
Mhm.
some information about that. And a tip, always go to the next image if you're scrolling through because there's the backside of the card. And a lot of times that's got weight, hair color, eye color, complexion, some information, whether there's disabilities or anything. So, but again, doesn't necessarily mean they serve. So let's talk about enlistment records. What do you know?
So enlistment records, obviously that depends on their what they've done and what branch they're going into, especially with World War II, because you have to also understand there's going to be record collections at NARA, the National Archives. And that's one of the key things they'll want to know if you do order anything. There's a fire that actually happened at I believe their St. Louis
It was in St.
location.
Louis. Yeah.
And I think just because of the way the records were stored, that it by branch, there was more damage to others than some.
Yeah, I believe the Army records for World War II were mostly destroyed, and I think there was some Navy records as well, so it's kind of hit or miss as to whether you're gonna find those records. If you write for the records, and I've done this because I didn't know early on when I wrote for these records that this fire had occurred, and they wrote back with this boilerplate thing, that was part of the group that was destroyed in the fire, and from the pictures and everything I've read, they didn't actually burn up, they actually got wet. They were in the basement, all the water from the fire came down into the basement and molded all of these records, and so very few of those records that were in that basement survived, so we have service records, which I think you probably have more experience with than anything else. Tell us about service records, and I know there's acronyms that I cannot even remember half the time.
Yeah. So something that, because I have a lot of military in my family, I think just having this distinction, you can order someone's papers or their records, but understanding what you're looking for is also pretty key so that you're not either writing twice or you're understanding exactly what you're getting. I ordered a copy of my great grandfather, his name was Delio Garcia. I ordered his service record, which was OMPF. That's Official Military Personnel File. Within that sort of first one or two pieces of paper in the file are the DD 214. That's the name of the document or the form number. And sometimes that's referred to as separation papers because you're basically like genealogy, you're going to work backwards from their separation and then up through enlistment. That's going to be the DD 214 is kind of like a cover sheet that kind of it's going to summarize essentially the person's time in service, and it can really be helpful. Some of the things that are on there are going to be codes or acronyms and things like that. So either Googling those, putting them in Chat GPT, or if you happen to know someone, I highly recommend you go ask someone who might have served, especially if it's the same branch.
I think you did
Um,
that, didn't you? Didn't you have an uncle or somebody you kept asking what these things meant?
yeah, so my stepdad is also a Marine,
Mm,
and my great grandfather served in World War II as a Marine.
okay.
And so because I had that quick just, "Hey, can you tell me what this is?" Putting that into context, and then I also reached out to this really, really kind gentleman, and I wish I remembered his name, but years ago, I reached out trying to find information about my great-grandfather's time at the VFW, the Veterans Foreign Wars, and he was big, big into the American Legion. So I was trying to ask for some context from him as well, and he was so kind, gave his time, and helped me out.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So what can a person do if they can't find some of these records or maybe they were burned? Are there other records that we could look for that could help us at least piece together, you know, some of the time served, you know?
Mhm. Absolutely, yes. Ancestry now owns Fold 3. So Fold 3 is a huge resource for military records. Even if you're just getting an index of something, at least there's some evidence there that could kind of point you in the right direction. There are other alternative records. I think you found out through ChatGPT, they actually offer some sort of alternatives too. So did you want to cover those?
Well, I know that and I've found some of these in the past,
Mm.
pay vouchers, for example. Sometimes you'll find unit histories, and a lot of times you can find the unit history information on NARA, the National
Mhm.
Archives and Records Administration. Sometimes you can find some of just Google. If you happen to know the unit that your person served, you might be able to Google some of that information and find other people have built websites and all kinds of things. You might find some hospital admission cards if somebody was sick. I found so many hospital admission cards for one guy. I just was like, okay, he's got a sore throat again. Okay. Moving on, you know. But even after a person served, there may be benefit records, those
Mhm.
kind of things that didn't get lost in a fire. It just depends on the branch too. And
Yeah.
so, you may be able to find some of that information. I think I personally, no matter what conflict or time period a person served, I like to go dig up the unit histories because it can really, especially, I've got a couple that are before World War II that were in the Civil War that were captured and injured, and following the unit histories and learning about the battle and knowing the date that they were captured and then learning about that battle, is fascinating. I do have a family member also who was a POW in World War II,
Mhm.
and he left behind 2 diaries, and they're absolutely phenomenal.
Wow.
One of them is all written day by day, what was going on, how they were trading cigarettes for boots, I mean, that he
Mhm.
was like the store. He was the guy who you went to get anything, and their currency was cigarettes. So if
Mhm.
you were a smoker, you were burning up your currency, and I think probably most everyone was smoking back then, but
Yeah.
there were times he was talking about the rations and how at certain points, depending on what the supply chain was getting to the POW camp, sometimes they were splitting one, they call what was it, a Red Cross box that was supposed to be 1
Mhm.
box per day per guy, and sometimes they were splitting 1 box for 7 guys for, like, 4 or 5 days, and so they were lucky to have a slice of bread,
Oh, yeah.
but they also had cigarettes in those boxes, so
Mhm.
they're getting replenished with their supply, but, he always had the boots and the socks and the things that those guys needed. He was the barter guy. And then the other journal that he had were all images. The
Oh,
very front of
wow.
the book, it's got a huge American flag that says America Forever, and it's all done in like pencil, like colored pencils. It was really phenomenal. And then there's a bunch of pictures in there of the POW camp and soldiers holding guns and barbed wire, and then the very end of the book, he writes, "We can hear the gunfire getting closer and closer. The guards have suddenly left." And then he writes in big letters, "Liberated," on the last page. And it is just, to me, that was one of the family artifacts that it gives me chills just thinking about it. And then there's one page after that where he writes home with family, like a month later. Because what happened was the last page or two in this journal, he talks about, okay, we've been liberated and we're giving all our food to the local people who have been helping us because they would sneak out of camp and steal stuff, or they would, most of the time, the locals would give them bread, which is really
Mhm.
what they wanted. And so there's in the picture book, the one that he was drawing in, there's shots of there's like all pencil drawing, but guys with loaves of bread sticking out of their pockets.
Oh. Mhm.
He's trying to depict the fact that these guys are coming back from say, a daytime work camp or something where the local women have been giving them bread. After that last page when he says he's liberated, and then he writes, like, a page or 2, I can't remember, about how they gave away all their food, and they were expecting that the rescue trucks were gonna be there that morning, and it was like a week later, they had no food. It was like a week later before they actually were able to get out of that camp, even though they were not under guard anymore. They literally did not have, because they gave it all away thinking those guys are gonna be here any minute, and it
Yeah.
took them a week for them to get transport out of there, but
Oh
anyway,
my gosh.
it was a wild story. Something we didn't talk about was medals and awards that people may have
Mm.
earned or received while in service.
Mhm.
Those alone might have some interesting stories behind them.
Yes, absolutely. So putting things into context, especially if you understand which medals or which ribbons will be on their uniforms, that can give you a big indication of what their unit history is and or what they've done as an individual.
You probably have to do some Google searching or ChatGPT or something to figure out what some of these are if you don't know. Also, keep in mind with any conflict, keep an eye on the census records. because sometimes you'll see people disappear. I know Brian Reinhardt, when he was talking about the Civil War records, he was saying, "Hey, if they're, showing up in the 1860 census, but they disappear in the 1870 census, it might be he was killed in the war," you know? So, there's that. One of the things that this journal I was just telling you about had a ton of photographs of, I don't know how he collected all these photographs, but pasted in this book are shots of German soldiers and shots of military people and all these black and white photographs with the little sculpting edges around the photographs.
Yeah, that
Uh,
scalloped edge
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
yeah, and, like, a little date or a year.
Yeah, a lot of
Mhm,
these are not labeled. I would love to know who some of these people are, but and a lot of them were German soldiers and German tanks and German, all kinds of different military shots, but, I mean,
mm,
it's just a super valuable resource.
mhm.
What else am I missing here?
Well, and to give you some context too, if you are looking at those photos, if you can identify, say, German, you might be able to understand which theater the person actually served in.
Oh, good
Um,
point.
because, like, for me, my great grandfather served in the Pacific Theater. He was over in Guadalcanal. So for his unit, a very different history, a different path geographically, too.
I find the World War II history just fascinating.
Hmm.
I have a great uncle who served in Pearl Harbor at the time of the bombing,
Yes.
and he was on one of the ships that did not sink. But
Wow.
he told stories to me about when the attack happened, smoke is going everywhere, and all of a sudden, they're getting the sirens, for battle stations, where the guys have to go to their battle stations. He said to me, and this just stuck in my mind, he said he was sleeping, I think, in a bunk, at the lowest level of the ship, but he said when his job during battle stations was to carry ammunition to the big guns on the top deck. And he said normally, and so you got these ladders, you have to go up these ladders with these big giant bullets, basically. And he said normally it would take two guys to carry one. That's how heavy they were. He said the adrenaline was pumping so hard that one guy was carrying two. He
Oh,
said
yeah.
what happened was they carry him all the way up to the top deck, and then they'd throw one over one shoulder, throw another over the other shoulder, and they'd run like heck across the deck to the gun that they're supplying,
Trying to load.
and he
Mhm.
said the incoming Japanese
The kamikazes?
planes were, ratcheting what do they call that? Strafing the ship with the bullets, and he said people were falling all around him. He said the adrenaline was running so hard, you just kept going and pray you didn't get hit. And he
Mm.
said the guys in front of him were dropping, the guys behind him were dropping, he just didn't know how he survived it, but he managed to get all the way over there, and he survived the whole thing, and he lived to tell about it. I think the University of Texas, he was a Texan. He went and did an interview with them. I think the University of Texas has a bunch of interviews from these guys. Just the whole education of that whole conflict, to me is fascinating. I mean, there's so much to it. There's so many different locations and so many different places that our our people served, and it's just amazing. I encourage people to write down what they know while they can, because these
Yeah.
stories don't live forever. All right, so I guess some of the closing tips is to pay attention to registration versus enlisted versus served, because you
Mhm.
might have different sets of records and whether they actually served or not. I was doing some research on this, and I was like thinking, well, what is the difference between enlisted and served? And I was Googling, actually ChatGPT, asking, what is the difference? And Chat came back and said, well, they could have enlisted, but not served. I'm like, how so? How is this? And it was like they may not have passed the health screening.
Oh,
They
mhm.
may not have passed boot camp and were booted out of the service because they couldn't hack it. There's a couple different things to think about there. So
Mhm.
That's a possibility. So, again, correlating evidence as always. And if you're new to genealogy, that's where we compare records with other types of records, similar records, just to make sure that we have the right person. Yeah, good stuff.
Mhm.
Any
And I would highly recommend, of course, looking at NARA, their website, NARA, because if you're ever confused about eligibility, they do have it on their website. It may take a bit of digging because so much of it depends on when and where, of course, whatever you're looking for.
right?
Because generally speaking, the rule of thumb, because of their locations, if anything is prior to 1917, that's generally World War One. Anything prior would probably be in either of the two locations that are in Washington, D.C. If you're looking for anything more recent, that's 1917 through present, they're going to have those records likely at St. Louis location.
Yeah. Of course, you can always start with, Ancestry, Fold 3, Family Search, see if they've
Yes.
got anything. There's so many different databases too. And if your ancestor happened to have been injured, there might be a casualty list or a death registry if they died during the service. It never hurts to check with the state archives. Local newspapers is another one. We
Oh,
didn't even
yes.
really talk about that, but a lot of times when our people were being shipped out, there may have been a list of, a newspaper article that says boys headed off to war, and
Mhm.
it may list the local crew who's headed off being shipped out on
Mhm.
Saturday morning. They're catching a bus to go to, Fort Bragg or whatever. So, be looking at the newspapers in the state archives as well. And maybe even the local county libraries might have something, but look everywhere.
There's a lot more online that might be more easily accessible than you think. You don't always have to resort to writing for those papers, especially if, it's expensive. Sometimes it can be. The process has been more streamlined since I wrote for my great grandfather's record. So a lot of stuff is online now.
Well, thanks for sharing your experience because you've got a little bit more experience with some of these World War II records than I do. I haven't really had the need to dig into that, but super. Well, thanks so much for sharing, and for everybody at home or listening, we'll catch you in the next episode.
Sounds
Bye.
good. Bye.